y educación en tiempos de pospandemia. Para aquellos que recién se conectan, mi nombre es Mercedes Renault, soy la oficial ejecutiva de la Oficina para América Latina del IPE UNESCO y les iré presentando los diferentes momentos de la agenda de trabajo a lo largo del foro. Antes de comenzar, los invitamos a prender las cámaras, así nos vemos un poco las caras. Y también quisiera solicitarles a quienes no lo hayan hecho todavía, tengan a bien renombrar su usuario de Zoom, escribiendo primero su nombre completo y a continuación su institución y su país de residencia. Les recuerdo también los canales de ayuda por cualquier inconveniente técnico o consulta. Tienen a disposición el teléfono fijo de nuestra oficina, el número de WhatsApp o el mail que aparecen también en estos momentos en el chat. Esta sesión será grabada y estará disponible dentro de algunas horas. También vamos a elaborar un breve resumen del panel que estará
tell you about a small brief summary. Both the video and the summary will be in the microsite of the forum, the link of which is also on the chat. Finally, I wish to tell you that after the panel members' presentations, there is a Q&A session. For those of you who want to participate, please put your questions in the chat, and according to the time available, we will give you the floor and open your mic so that you can ask your question on the mic. When it's finished, you will have a very brief survey to know your opinion about this seminar. So please take a few moments of your time to fill out the survey because your feedback is extremely important to us. We now move to panel number 4 on education, human mobility, and ethnics. I will give the floor to Carlos Vargas Tames of the Office of Education for Latin America and the Caribbean, who will be the moderator. Carlos, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mercedes, and thank you, all of you, for those who have been following the forum and those who will be following with this fourth panel. As Mercedes was saying, it is dedicated to the topics of ethnicity and human mobility. Welcome to all of you to the Educational Forum of the IIP, organized together with the GEM Report Office and my office, the Education Forum of Latin America for Education of the UNESCO. This panel will deal with two main topics of educational exclusion in the region. It has not one is related to ethnicity and the other with human mobility. These are two topics that fight against us. On the one hand, because of the structural racism of our societies, which leads the indigenous populations, the Afro descendants, the Raizales, the Palenqueros, or any other ethnic people they have been mentioned by Silvina in her preparatory document for this report. These are twice excluded from education. Once because of the inequality of access, but also because of the discrimination of the representation of the peoples in the curricula, in the texts, leaving aside, of course, the knowledge of the indigenous populations, their cultural practices, and a number of knowledge that can be extremely rich and can enrich us when they are really given the priority they deserve. We are talking about flexibility and other values. On the other hand, there is the human mobility issue. This is also a constant in our region. I would say rather the standard than the exception in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, the internal or international displacement, the labor displacement, migrations due to violence, to armed conflicts, climate changes, or you name it, they are still hampered by formalities, papers, no transition, prohibitions, and so on. And to these bureaucratic requirements, we also find underlying those a number of fights or migration discrimination in the case of Venezuela or Haiti, amongst so many others. These are things that really are painful for the region. as a whole. So, in this panel, we'll be seeing both topics, and we have some wonderful experts, a luxury panel, two experts in the field of indigenous population education and interculturality. One of them is the author of the panoramic study, Mrs. Silvina Corbetta, who will be introduced later on, but we welcome her, and Mrs. Elena Burga, who is also a topic, but from the public administration side in Peru. We also have two experts in the field of education and human mobility, Milena Montoya, who is the author of one of the papers on migration in Colombia, and Susana Urbano, who is an expert in education under emergency. We will first give the floor to those who wrote the GEM report original papers, and then we will move to the recommendations by the other two speakers. I just want to remind you that you can ask your questions in the chat, and there will be some time after the presentations for you to be able to ask a question either by yourselves on the microphone or read by some of us. And also to remind your panel and each of the panel members that we have 15 minutes per panel member. So we'll start with Milena Montoya. She is an economist and she has a vast experience in development project with emphasis in policies and strategies for an inclusive quality education. So monitoring and the project of SDGs of the UNDP in Colombia. She's coordinating the acceleration SDG 4 program. It's an agency between the UNDP and the UNESCO in Colombia. You have the floor. Thank you very much, she says. Everyone, especially UNESCO, for allowing me to carry out this research and the UNDP. We have done this with two other colleagues with you of the UNDP, Cristina Escobar and Tenesis, and it is an agency. It's a work with we contribute to the report of report for everybody with no exception. First of all, because we don't have enough time, I will show you the method we use of this for this study, and then we will underscore four conclusions of the diagnosis that were used to get to the main findings of the study. As you can see, the scope of this survey started with a design, a review of primary and secondary sources, and then analysis. We had an approach on rights, as is done by UNDP, and then closing the gaps between the different zones and territories of Colombia, and which are also a different momentum of what is being done in terms of migration. The goals of sustainable development, SDGs, we stemmed from SDG 4. It is not only an ending in itself, We chose the topic of governance and finance among the six ones that talk to exclusion. We chose this governance and finance topic mainly because we thought that it was the starting point for the guarantee of the right to education, an effective governance, a good governance, and a proper funding of all of the educational system in Colombia. That is absolutely of the essence to reach the SDG 4. As a main primary and secondary source, we took all of the standards of the Ministry of Education, national reports, the platform of answer of the HNCCR, and everything else that has to do with migrant populations entering Colombia, other sources, and we also carried out a number of interviews to relevant players of different sectors. In the analysis, we looked for seeing what is the answer of the country in funding based on the standards, based on the design and policies and the adapting of existing policies, also putting emphasis on the processes and procedures that were being carried out to try to reach inclusion of the Venezuelan students, and with the assistance of the local and national governments, together with all of the relevant players. We took very good experiences, and I ask you to please revisit them because they can be scalable to other territories, and they show what can be done in a country with these different players when you want to include everybody. And we took a number of ideas to deepen the analysis of the other central topics of the Global GEM report, which, although not being the main gist of this study, they are still useful for other purposes. I will first get to the findings.
So we have as a reference, Colombia is the country with the higher number of migrants coming from Venezuela. So we need to meet the needs with structural solutions. 15% of the Venezuelan population has migrated, especially to other Latin American countries, and over one-third of the population is reaching Colombia. By May 2020, around 1.7 million people came from Venezuela into our country. The pandemic has reduced this estimate because we expected 2.5 million this year from Venezuela. From this 1.5 million, around 763,000 are regular population that is already settled down, and 424,000 we consider them irregular population. And the status is not regular in the country, so they cannot access social services, the labor market benefits. 424,000 are children and adolescents between 0 and 17 years of age, and 287,000 between 5 and 17 years could be considered for school age. Now, for you to get an idea of the migration crisis in the country, from 2014, we had 23,000 people coming from Venezuela into the country, and by 2016, we had 71% more, and in 2017, we had 403,000 people entering our country, an increase of 651%. And 2018, the leap was even bigger, to 1.7 million. So in Colombia, this accounted for a real crisis. Plenty of migrants from Venezuela. And it is something that now we see the pandemic and we know what it is to face a major crisis. But at that time, it was a huge crisis. And the figure has been going down, but it's not a significant decrease, 1.722 coming from Venezuela has been the latest figure. Yes, because some Colombians are coming back, but it's mainly from Venezuela, of Venezuelan origin. The second conclusion that we would like to highlight from this diagnosis is the policy of the Colombian state that has tried to move ahead in the guarantee of the access to the education system of all girls, boys, and adolescents coming from Venezuela without taking into account whether their status is regular or irregular, and for their access to the education, of course. We have made migration policies more flexible. We have eliminated legal barriers for access, and we have opened the way for educational care. So now we issue permanence or settlement permits to Venezuelans in order to access state-provided services. The elimination of legal barriers for the access of education was materialized. The girls and boys in Venezuela can enter any education institution in Colombia without having an ID or without having any supporting documentation of previous education cycles. Before they needed visa and they needed to be have a regular status in the.
Esta es la ruta,
This is the route with non-stop, and the Ministry of Education has made it possible to guarantee a quota, and they are guaranteed access to the institution even if they didn't have a visa or a regular status in our country. This is a sample of that first base for the inclusion of migrant children. So in 2018, we had 34,000 that accessed education from Venezuela, and the number has increased to 206,000. And the Colombian education institutions have received around 330,000 Venezuelan children by September this year. They are reaching the border districts, the main cities such as Bogota, Medellin, Barranquilla, and their families find better conditions to live there. And the same happens with the rest of the population. Most of them are concentrated on primary and secondary schools, a lower percentage in high education and early infancy education, because the coverage rates at these levels are quite low. And there is the biggest challenge, to guarantee education. So the Colombian government had to spend $160 million last year. The Colombian government is investing that and had not been foreseen for this population. Now, despite all these efforts, we have a third finding, which is I cannot see the presentation.
Un segundo. Sí, el tercer hallazgo es que se presentan desafíos.
There are challenges, structural challenges, but also specific challenges for the guarantee to access education. So there should be an availability of quotas. That's the first stop or step. But there are several districts where there are no quotas for these children to join the educational institutions. So the people in charge go to the Secretariat of Education, the different institutions, and they don't find room for their children to enter, or vacancies. Many of the municipalities they reach are quite weak in terms of institutional capabilities. Their education system is weak, as well as their staffing, so children cannot access these education institutions. And then there is the problem of the necessary documentation they need to submit to register. Although there is a rule to avoid this rule is not well known in all territories, and the secretariats of education should enforce it. And from the national ministry, more campaigns should be put in place. So in many of those education institutions, they demand from their parents that they present or submit the support documentation of prior school cycles of their children. And also the convalidation for higher education. Young people coming from Venezuela don't bring their diplomas, their certificates, and cannot enter the higher education institutions. And to study at higher education institutions, you require or we demand that the titles be with the corresponding apostille. And in Venezuela, there is no possibility to issue an apostille. Therefore, we interviewed some families, and really, despite the fact that many of the families are aware of the importance that children are linked to education, they cannot take them because of the employment, exclusion conditions, hunger. So there are many factors associated preventing children from entering or accessing the education system. Fourth, we identified that education performance that is full and effective has quite a few limitations, and the limitations are the same that Colombian children have. This migration crisis has revealed the existing conditions in the country and all the structural barriers that existed in the Colombian education system. So the education system is fragile with great room of improvement. So the education system is marked by laws that limit access to education. So there is a need to strengthen the education management system at all levels. There is a disruption between competencies at a local level and competencies at a national level. So that gap has to be bridged. And there are many districts in the country that are weak in their resources and competencies. And there is the need to connect the response, or the emergency response, and move to stabilization and integration. We were working hard on responding to the emergency, hand in hand with the cooperation. But this now should move to stabilization and integration of the families, because these are families that have this vocation to remain in the country. They won't return to Venezuela necessarily, but they need to remain in the country. And it's necessary to improve international support. This is a call by the ministry regarding all the services needed to stabilize children in the school. So welfare, permanence. Colombia is a middle income country, so resources for cooperation are more scarce for Colombia. And what is being done in terms of migration, most of it comes from Colombians' pockets. So international cooperation has not been the main resources for this. Milena, please, you have 1 minute to go. We analyzed also the other four topics: curricula, teachers, schools, communities, and in the report you find the main ideas behind these topics to continue working, and we have highlighted some strategic points. This is very strong. We have services for children, food, the response by UNICEF, the funding of the school humanitarian corridor from the Ministry of Education, the Cannot Way Colombian Education Program, the Educa Paz National Program on Education, and the learning spaces for boys and girls that are out of school and in emergency situations. So you can refer to the study whenever you want. Thank you. Thank you, Milena, for this presentation. I think this puts on the table some of the most serious consequences for migrant populations. You talk of how important it is to make migration policies more flexible, or the support documentation that they need to submit, the revalidation and convalidation of studies, something to work on. And you talked about something that Susanna could also expand on, that is the different conditions inherent to being a migrant. They usually make it to the most distant or remote rural locations, the poorest school, and there are conditions of underprivilege that build up because of the socioeconomic strata or stage, gender issues, gender-related issues, etc. So now let me give the floor to Susana. Susana Urbano is an architect, and she has a degree in human rights, sustainable development, and international migrants law. She is from Venezuela, and she is advisor to the management of disasters with a focus on education. So, Susana, please, why don't you tell us about your work, and why don't you give us a regional perspective regarding Latin America and the Caribbean? I will put my timer here. Thank you for this briefing on my profile. Let me thank the regional office of the IIEP for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's an honor for me. Is a good moment to reflect on what can cause exclusion in our region. Now, I will offer a humanitarian perspective. My field of action regionally is as a leader of the regional group of education, Red Flag and R4B, and we work on humanitarian assistance to childhood in the education sector during crisis times, be it disasters or migration situations. So as we will see later on, this has been a problem in our region in the last few years. So let me share my presentation. I have called this presentation Guaranteeing the Right to Education in the Face of Migration. This is a reflection on the fact that what we are looking for is to generate alternatives, recommendations to avoid exclusion. And it's part of our steps as of our mission, and that is that all children, adolescents should be guaranteed their right to education. And I will talk about that later too. I believe that it is obvious for everybody why we had to guarantee the right to education. But I also thank Milena for the briefing, the magnifying lens on the reality of migration in Colombia. But there is something I had to take into account in education policies regarding education and inclusion. It's not only transport and mobility we should focus on. Of course, we have the Venezuelan situation and all other migration flows now with the pandemic, but there is mobility, internal mobility that we should focus on at the level of Latin America and the Caribbean. Last year, there were around 2 million people migrating internally without going beyond their borders, national borders. 80%, it was because of disaster conditions, natural disasters or social natural disasters. See how important it is. So to these disaster conditions this year, we had to add COVID. Yesterday, the education minister, Montserrat Kremer, said that in Ecuador, in internal mobility, they've had 200,000 children and adolescents displaced because of COVID. What does this imply? What's the impact that this has on the education system, especially with COVID and virtual education and the resources to be spent on children? So when they become migrants, this is even more difficult. Therefore, until now, only in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have around the world a migration of 5.2 million Venezuelans that have left the borders, gone beyond the borders, but it affects the continent with 4.3 million that have migrated. And we see the concentration. You see the concentration here to the southern cone, where the country with the most concentration is Colombia, and this trickles down to the south until it reaches Chile. The migration crisis of the Venezuelan situation, as it is called R4B, the platform R4B, points out that it is the biggest migration impact in contemporary history in our region, and it will become one of the biggest migration crises also globally. But we should point out that in our continent, we have serious migration crisis in Central America, that in this geographical space can be seen very clearly. We have the migration caravans going to the north of the continent, looking for the American dream, and they are also the subject of educational exclusion. We will talk about that diversity of the different aspects or variables or dimensions that are included in education exclusion. So, Colombia, the impact received by the public education systems without getting into the impact of the private education system. I will make a comment there too, where we have an impact that 3.4% of the population is made up by Venezuelan migrant students. And Minister Kremer also mentioned that at least there were 65,000 children from Venezuela in the education system during the pandemic. So what does this mean in terms of an impact? Now, in terms of exclusion, I will give you a very specific figure because it's strange to find, it's one of the vacuums that we have for planning the exact figures, okay? The National Institute of Statistics in Peru says that there is a huge amount of children from 12 to 16 years of age, 40.2% attend or have access to education. 59.8% don't. It is because they don't have access, because of different dimensions we will analyze, or because simply for other conditions of vulnerability conditions, they don't. When they are integrated, they don't go to school 60% of the time. So there are situations that play against permanence. Once they have access, they cannot remain. In primary school is different, okay? 54% is not studying. The prevalence of integration is towards more females than males, despite the fact that there is certain difficulty and gender inequality that we will mention too. And really, the situation is worsened in initial education, right? Where a huge proportion of migrants at initial education, 64%, don't have access to this type of initial education, what we call initial education. So this tells a lot about the percentage of the population and the conditions of where the problem is heading. And what happens? What's happening now in times of COVID? The education system had its doors open, but the education system is now not attending another problem. We have plenty of children affected because of the COVID that were outside of the classrooms, more than 100 million, and more than 50% are still out of classrooms. So the migrant problem is invisible now. Because of the size of the crisis, of the crisis, this percentage of the problem of this group is made invisible. So it's so difficult at this point to have a specific point, how many migrants have been affected, children, I mean, because if they were not part of the education system, we cannot count them. So we don't know really what's happening with the migrant population, with inclusion or the exclusion in the education system. Now, the diversity of the population in the region is varied. First, we have the situation of children or population that is moving or that is in transit. That is to say, they're displaced. They are the walkers. They move from one place to the next. Short period of times, long period of times, but they walk. They don't stay in the same place. We have migrants in process of integration. This phenomenon that I'm mentioning could be internally or externally. Now we are going to make more emphasis transporter, okay? Because it's the biggest crisis that we are making, we are trying to focus on what's impacting education systems as an overload. And we have migrant population process of integration and migrant population that is coming back to the country. Coming back to Venezuela or to the second country of origin, because that's the other phenomenon. They stay here for some time, there is a crisis or something happened in the family, they migrate to the country of origin, it's not even pendular, it's going back in the migration process. With COVID, this has been reversed because they are going back to their own countries because they feel unprotected in terms of accesses to different rights. Now, around these conditions of this type of mobility, we see socioeconomic conditions, and my predecessors have said it. The situation of legality, their migration situation, gender-based violence, disability that is invisible. In the previous panel, we've seen that out of 10 children with a disability, 7 don't have access to the education. What happens when these children are migrants? They are twice as vulnerable if they don't have the socioeconomic conditions, let alone that, because there we start to get into xenophobia, as our Spanish philosopher, dear one, Adela Cortina said, because the socioeconomic situation marks you. If you have the money, private school, or you have migrated in very good socioeconomic conditions, very likely you won't be uh, before those exclusions.
We have the cultural difficulties that include cosmogonia, the indigenous populations which migrate. We also have a language difference that are part of the differences of the indigenous population, lack of information in migration, the the health conditions prevailing among the populations. All of this gets together for these boys and girls either have no access to education or very poor access. So, as you can see, I'm sure I won't have any time because I have eaten up all my time, but it is important to see from the public policies perspective how we are going to tackle this issue. And I have to underscore one thing. When we talk about public policies, it is obvious it is up to the state to take up their responsibility, that is internal mobility, reception of these populations, the impact that is oversaturating the system in itself already weakened, at least in our region, because that is our trademark, if I may use that expression. But when we, although we have an improvement in quality, we have problems because of infrastructure, capacity, the teachers' training process, because of the crisis that come about because of acts of God. This is another issue. The educational system is more brittle because of some elements or that have an intensive impact, an earthquake, a flood, a drought, you name it. So we are affected by this. Carlos, please let me know when I'm overboard. I still have 2 minutes. Thank you. I will not have enough time for the main challenges, as we said before. That is why we have the normative vacuum. We have the challenges of planning because of these vulnerable systems, the administrative, technical, and the enrollment problems, and of course, the degree validation. There are many efforts deployed in in Panama, in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile. There are efforts made by public policies, but we do have a vacuum because many of these decisions are, for example, executive decisions. In other words, they are part of the decrees of the government, but they never dribble down to the actual facts. So we have to start looking at those decisions. Since Quito, we had specific recommendations for these efforts to be carried out. Another issue that is impacted and has to do with the issue for the recommendations, I will leave you that because I definitely didn't have enough time. It's the diversity of the population. All of the things we mentioned, plus xenophobia, poorphobia, who are over and beyond the problems that have already been dealt with. Regarding the recommendations, I will mention them very fast. That is, improve the systems for evidence generating. The exercise carried out by Milena is fantastic, but now we have to do much more from the UN, the civil society, whatever. We have to do a big effort to face this crisis because in the migration crisis, it is taken as a humanitarian crisis. We have to improve systems. We have to have figures so as to be able to plan better. But this crisis must also take into account gender sensitive actions, disability sensitive actions, etc. We also need educational integration to have a landing on the territory. And Milena said that. There are very good examples in Peru, in Ecuador, because one thing is what happens, because we have big commitments from the national policies, the executive decrees, but then when this comes, when push comes to shove, all of a sudden we see that it is not only a question of taking care of the migrant child because we are under migration problems, but we have also a number of things that have to be resolved in the long run. We don't have enough teachers. If they have, are they, if we do, are they properly trained to face the migrants in their classrooms? We don't know about that. The other thing, and I go back because it is very important when we are talking for about accountability. When we talk about accountability, it is case number one. It is the we have to give a voice to these migrants, especially in adult world migrant children. We have a world that is centered where we do not listen to kids. The other thing is the participation of civil society organizations, not only from humanitarian organizations, but also the base organizations that are supporting these policies and that may contribute to support the state in its main role as the educating body. Then we have to coordinate with the acknowledgement of studies favoring fostering the educational cycle because access is not all. They have to finish. And then in the further cycles, they have to get into as a productive society. So here it has to do with policies that have to be agreed upon at a regional level, across borders, or throughout the region, but also how this is actually turned into something positive for the kids and their environment. Develop or strengthen flexible model to foster integration of kids with social protection guaranteeing permanence and the ending of educational cycles. In other words, the educational sector is multilateral, so to speak. It must be acting in an intersectoral manner to cater for the kids in a holistic fashion. We cannot take an education policy for the kids if we don't bring those about with other politicians such as protection, water, sewage, and in general, social protection of families, or in the case of Venezuela, how to not expulse or Central America. What happens with our policies that they are pushing the kids outside of their countries, especially in Central America? That is access to service. Susan, Susana, Susan, yes, sorry, and working in the follow-up of these populations. I just want to say and guarantee and reaffirm what we have said before. The right to education, it saves lives. It gives us the opportunity of a life that is dignified. And last thing, for the regional group, we are we keep on supporting UNESCO, the IIP, with Save the Children, UNICEF at a regional level, but there are many organizations of civil society and also United Nations supporting these processes. Please, you are not alone. You know that you can count on us with a support that we can give to you, maybe not so much with money, because humanitarian life is not enough, but especially the education sector, which has never been seen as a priority when it should be, because it is the one that leads to other rights for boys and girls. With this, goodbye. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went overboard with the time, but there you have my email address on the screen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susanna, for this presentation. I'm sure we will have during the Q&A session a possibility. Yes, yes, of course. Yeah. I was saying that thank you very much, Susanna, for this presentation, that we will have an opportunity during the Q&A session to deepen some of the topics you have mentioned, very many of them, and also to underscore the historical and cultural value of internal mobilization, migration, and others. And a very important topic that you touched upon, I believe is essential, is the role of the state to create a public, safe place where dialogue is not only important for the NGOs and international organizations, which very often are the ones that arrive there where the states do not wish to be, and who are in charge of the humanitarian response. That is the participation of the players themselves. And also to talk about the difference between efforts from integration to sustainability, the facts that make it sustainable over time and that relate to protection, social protection factors in a wide sense of the term. So, Susana, thank you again for this presentation. And we will now move to the topic of ethnicity. In other words, how ethnicity is an exclusion factor in Latin America and the Caribbean, but with some elements that will be dealt with or will be dealing with what Susana and Milena said before because of the intertwining. One of the characteristics of the region is diversity. However, this diversity is not to be seen in systems. Uh, Also, in the case of the indigenous populations, the Afro descendants, which is not a minor problem. The report shows that the challenges in the region link to the fact that this is where most of the population of the indigenous populations are, between 120 and 170 million people located in Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and Ecuador, and in the Caribbean regions, populations which the ancestors of which were enslaved. And to tackle this topic of ethnicity, we will start with Silvina Corbetta. She is a politologist, a specialist in environmental sciences and specialized in family agriculture in the University of Santiago del Estero. She's an Argentine specialized in educational policies in the Latin American educational systems and interculturalism. She's been a consultant. So, Silvina, it's a pleasure to have you among us. You do have 15 minutes, you know that. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to be able to participate in this meeting. Thank you, Carlos. I will share my screen and I will ask you to be patient because I have a very poor bandwidth right now. So it is likely that I will be giving internet from my cell phone. I hope that you are having my presentation on your screen. Very good. It's called the other ethnics and the dynamic of inclusion exclusion in Latin America. It's part of the input of the GEM report for our region. This is a path of what we will be going through. Then some general data, very brief. Then I will move to the Colombian and Ecuadorian cases with the policies in the field of interculturality, which is organization, curricula, teachers, community, parents, and students, where things where the GEMS report was interested for us to work. And if I have enough time, I will also talk to some innovating issue, which comes from Bolivia and El Salvador, and also finally a synthesis of things that cannot be reported, that cannot be procrastinated. Now, starting point, we can think about theory and methodology. First of all, we can say that the Afro descendants and the indigenous populations are not vulnerable. These are people that have been historically and systematically deprived of their rights. On the other hand, the idea of other ethnies, Van Dijk, as a question mark to society that conceives the notion of ethnics linked to the minor groups. Finally, I wish to say that the methodology through which we build this information comes from secondary sources. However, we had some interviews in the framework of our report. Some things that I believe to be essential is the difference between bilingual intercultural education, that's what people want and they are entitled to have, and the interculturality approach. The EIB, which is the educational system, the people's that is the bilingual intercultural education. This is what the systems have organized to be able to guarantee this right to education of the indigenous populations and the Afro descendants. On the other hand, the approach, when I talk about interculturality approach, I am thinking about intercultural education for all as a transverse approach where the subject must be the everybody, the white, the Creole, the black, which are difficult to deal with with other peoples, especially the indigenous. So the EIB, which is the bilingual intercultural education, and the transverse are two complementary methods to process them and to work on the asymmetries from education. And here, this idea that living together by both modalities of dealing with with the diversity, with the bilingual intercultural education, BIE, that are part of our society are two ways of looking at things. How many others do we have? Based on the estimates of 18 countries, these others are more than 154 million people, of course, with a different presence according to the countries. And so we don't see the number of people that relate to these others. in terms of achievements and educational achievements. There is a very interesting detail when we talk about achievements and gaps, and I have been forced to choose only two indicators, and I have made an unfair choice because I took the achievements of the indigenous populations between 6 and 22 that go to schools, a comparison between 2000 2010 shows in all countries and all ages an achievement in terms of a greater presence in schools. In terms of gaps, I have taken the 12 to 18, and here 12 and 17, I'm sorry, going to a school. In this case, I have had some exceptions, but in most of countries, we can see that the gap remains, the gap of non-absenteeism. In terms of some things that we have discovered based on national standards, based on we find that the BIE, which is ethno education or self education, we can see that until 2000, most of the educational laws were only said that the BIE is only for indigenous populations, and we see that most of the states say that the indigenous populations are always in rural contexts linked to the problems that came from the companies, with the exception of Mexico. The education laws are not referring to indigenous populations migrating to urban places. In terms of absenteeism, we have 14 out of 19 countries that talk about this. Regarding presence and absence, with the exception of Brazil and Colombia that already had it in their laws, there are all these countries that have something about it in their laws. These are the countries where the laws were adopted after the 2005. So it's important to understand these tools. And here we have 6 countries that have explicit laws. Then, regardless of the year of approval, 12 countries are there. And the fourth aspect, which is the use of languages, in other words, there are 8 countries that only mention the languages of the indigenous populations, I4, which somehow they talk about the Afro descendants. Nicaragua only talks about the Atlantic coast. Costa Rica does not mention them. It takes them, and then some countries that are not mentioned that. Fine. Regarding some of the aspects, I will go very fast. I think it is important the 2 cases where we have been working. One is Colombia and one is Ecuador. We will start with Colombia. Colombia has a general education law where ethno education exists. In other words, the ethnics issue is covered, and the indigenous law itself. In 2010, we have this education with a certain degree of autonomy. This is very detailed, but there's a mix of funding sources with external sources, general resources. But it's important to say that the standards are establishing some kind of percentage, and there are no technical supports to make them effective. And of course, it is not clear how, to what extent the communities are included, the communities which are are having forced displacements, as we saw this morning from one of our colleagues. In terms of law number 70, which is called the law of the Black communities in Colombia, we see a law that is taking into account elements for both the Afro descendants and the rest, which is called the Afro Colombian Studies School. And now these are the challenges. These are the procrastination of the application forms for the teachers. And the other thing is that the school is finally reduced to the autonomy and to the need of each institution. And this has been mentioned by one of the surveys that we carried out during our whole procedure. In the case of Ecuador, I said that there's something that is very important because it's the only issue about interculturality. And that standard, which is the organic law of BIE, has taken into account both strategies, that is interculturality for all, and the bilingual, the BIE for indigenous and Afro-descending peoples, and it is organized as a self-supporting body with the participation of a national service and the Institute of Languages of the population. Now, what happens with the Afro-Ecuadorian in Ecuador, and what are the initiatives? Well, although this law that we have mentioned does not cover what we have mentioned before, but that has been mentioned before in different documents, and the communities themselves do mention that. Here we can see that the information is dispersed, is scattered, that it talks about certain policies, although there is a lot of expectancy regarding ethno-education as announced in 2019, where when the study was announced, we don't know, it's so too soon, we don't know whether it has been done. In terms of curriculum, we will start with Colombia. It is important to see what happens in the indigenous populations system and what happens within the School of Afro-Colombian Studies. They are allowed to concentrate their pedagogical principles, but we don't have enough technical support, something that comes over and over again. There is also a problem, a collective construction of that curriculum that is also a big challenge regarding the players and the day-to-day aspects. The concern of the regarding the presence of NGOs that are also talking to the lack of presence of the state in some areas, and the case of the School of Afro-Colombian Studies. That is where we can see a big lack regarding the Afro-Colombian identity. There's not enough material. The Ministry of Education is pushing the different groups to include the topic of the school. So the state is demanding, but it is not complying with its own demands. On the other hand, we have lack of training. So very often they need more support. And then there's also the thing that the UNICEF and the University of Bogota has been observing of non-compliance to this standard. We will now go to Ecuador. Also a brief overview. what are the achievements and the challenges, and put emphasis on achievements that has to do with the design of national curricula, flexible enrollment that was mentioned this morning, that is very important for students to be able to circulate with no problems within the BRE. This in other countries is a big debt. The production of materials with the participation of the communities, but also with the state and the universities. And here's something that we will see later on that has to see with valuing the knowledge of the cultures themselves, and then to what extent the state saves certain commitments because it takes on board the ancestral knowledge of these peoples. The calendars. Here we have some comments that have to be made that we will see later on. Now, regarding education and Afro population, well, in Ecuador, just like in Colombia, we see a lack of specific contents regarding the Afro-Ecuadorian people. The literature is saying that we are researching and that the result of this research is not taken on board by the ministry, and that they are not really using the results of the asymmetry, and there is a trend towards thinking about the Afro descendants just as linked to slavery, nothing else. I also wish to say that most of the progress made has come from non-formal organizations, and this is very important for the Afro-descending populations to gain access to their own culture and knowledge. And finally, we have the agenda in the framework of international design, the issue of the public agenda regarding these populations, and the challenge between being part of the agenda and upholding autonomy. Regarding the schools and the teachers, we will see the Colombian case very fast. And here the SAPE is the indigenous system has problems. One of them is putting hierarchy within the system. There is a different contract system between standard teachers and the community system because they do not report to the same system. So the hiring, depending on the community system, are lost, and this is bad for the stability. And tensions that have to do with community teachers, those who belong to community, a lack of bilingualism of a number of teachers. This then translates into an issue when you don't know the language of the community. We will have to educate them in Spanish. And then there is no assessment that is relevant to that particular group. In terms of the Afro-Colombian Studies school, but that means that entails people who know the Palenquera language, which is that of that region. And this is something that has been mentioned, and the production of didactic materials on the one hand, and on the other hand, when these exist, the teachers cannot use them properly because they have stereotypes. Finally, the lack of knowledge of the teaching teams regarding the school, the rejection of that school, because we can have racism from the black towards the white. You will see that some of Silvina, sorry. you have 1 minute. In the case of the bilingual, the BIE, the challenges are related with a lack of investments to take interculturality throughout. Then we have problems related to the fact that the original language is only spoken during the socializing spaces, but not inside the classroom. Then there are things that are only addressing Afro Ecuadorians. First of all, the lack of a specific institutional in charge of specific policies and issues that resemble others, for example, training, lack of materials, and a very high presence of Afro descending students, many more than teachers, so they cannot really understand them. In terms of the community, parents, and students, I will mention only two items. First, at the medium level, there is not enough, there are too many racist policies, and in high school, students never manage to finish the high school degrees, and when they get to other places, they are discriminated against. This is the system in Colombia. The, and in the framework of the ethno education aimed at the Afro population in Colombia. The educational scenario reproduces racist actions, sometimes even used by the teachers themselves. I will have to skip that. The central issues, we see the tension in the community between the traditional initiatives and that are very important for the communities, the way in which they are captured by the states. This is a critical source, and the importance of a history or educational material where there is a history where the Afro descending communities are indeed present and covering the role their elders had before. I have no more time, so I will not talk about Bolivia, but although it's the most known one, maybe we can do that during the Q&A session. Only I want to mention El Salvador. The standard did not include indigenous populations, but stemming from the reform in 2014, a number of very intelligent initiatives comes around, organized by civil society, strengthened by the state. And then just to finish, a very synthesis and two questions. The synthesis is that the progress made is not enough because of the asymmetries. With the interruption of these asymmetries, the tough circle will force the system to continue, and the state actions do not include the white and Creole system because it weakens racism that is suffered by more than 150 million indigenous and Afro descending population members. Two things that cannot be postponed in terms that they can be answered in the short term. How much does every state of the region invest to guarantee the rights? And how much do the states invest in the interculturalization? These are the two questions. Sorry for the time that I took too much. Thank you very much, Silvina, for your presentation. I think that it is very encompassing, and we don't have enough time to see everything. That is why I left in the chat a link where you can find the reference documents. Silvina's full document, 94 pages, and Milena's full-fledged documents, and others as well, of course, that we have been using to prepare the GEM report. For example, that of Daniel, who is with us, Fanny. So, greetings to all of you, and Jimena Rubio as well, that the authors know very well because of the feedback they have been receiving from Jimena all of the time. Thank you, Silvina. We take good note of many of the topics that you have mentioned, amongst them the lack of cohesion, consistency between the different standards and everything that is needed for interculturality, the challenges of the information system, the teacher training that is absolutely not inexistent but insufficient, but it comes with the way that the teachers are being hired, those that are working with the indigenous populations, the Afro descendants, or these others, as you mentioned, a term that I loved in your report. To comment to this presentation and the challenges that Silvina is putting on table, we now have the pleasure to give you Elena Burga. She's an educator with a magister. She worked in the program of bilingual training in the Peruvian Amazonia, and she led the BIE in the Ministry of Education of Peru. She has been a Vice Minister of Interculturality in the Ministry of Culture of Peru. So, Elena, you can give us some of the most outstanding elements seen from public policy's perspective. You have your 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation. I will show my PowerPoint, but my screen, I have problems with my screen. It turns off and on its own, and I cannot put my slide.
Se prende la pantalla. Qué raro, ha estado bien todo este tiempo y ahora alguien de control puede poner.
Somebody from the organization can show my PowerPoint presentation, please.
Ya está trabajando equipo de producción en ello, Elena.
Sí, ahora lo
I
ponemos,
think
Elena. No te
it's
preocupes.
on its way. Just a second, Elena, please.
Ni siquiera puedo ver porque se me
Because I
apaga la
cannot
pantalla.
even see.
Nosotros te vemos y te escuchamos
Sí, ¿no?
bien.
Sí,
Si quisieras,
Sí,
sí, si
We
quieres empezar.
see you and we hear you properly. So if you want to start,
O sea, no puedo ver el PPT un
the
ratito.
problem is that I don't have the PowerPoint.
Un instante, pero no sé qué es lo que pasa.
I imagine this will be solved. Just a second, please. The team is working.
Bueno, yo creo que empiezo de todas maneras con algunos comentarios.
Adelante.
Uy, pero qué pena, no sé, no
I
entiendo
will
qué es.
start with
A ver, ya, creo
Ahí
que
está.
ya.
don't worry, we'll see how we solve that. There we go. Yes.
Hola.
And you can,
¿Puedes ponerlo ya en modo presentación, por favor? Ya, ahora sí empezamos entonces. Bueno,
Gracias.
primero, felicitar a
so
Silvina.
let's start. I want to congratulate Silvina for this presentation. One more. I also wanted to talk about some ideas for the indigenous populations and Afro-descending people.
O la pongo yo, ahora ya creo que puedo ponerla yo. Ya, ahí está, acceso. Y mejor la pongo yo, sí. No, nuevamente se me corta.
The speaker has lost her position.
Sí,
La ponemos
bueno, quería
nosotros y
mencionar
estás comentando.
que si pueden poner de todas maneras la...
Yes,
Y ahora sí.
if you can put the slide. I will talk about access, staying and ending, guaranteeing the trajectory of the populations and the quality linked to the cultural and linguistic existence. First of all, a small diagnosis that goes along the same lines as Silvina's. In terms of access, the indigenous population still is below national averages in all of the countries of the region. Even in grade school, the access is better, but yet, and in secondary education, access has the lowest access rates. We have done a lot of progress over the past 15 years, but it is the population with the biggest access problems. And it also has the highest degree of repeating index and dropout rate. There are 17 countries in the region that have a BIE, that have a bilingual intercultural education. In some cases, in most countries, it is called bilingual intercultural education. In others, it is called intercultural bilingual ethno education, but it's always the same. In terms of results, the indigenous populations have rates 3 times lower than those of the Spanish speaking populations. Or Portuguese speaking in the case of Brazil. In every country, we have had efforts aimed at encompassing the know-how of the indigenous populations in the curricula. However, it is very poor. Some people have had an intercultural focus in the educational system that is not well expressed in the national curriculum, and some of them that are aimed at indigenous populations. However, we see that the models adopted in every country and that have been pointed out in the BIE models, as the one Silvina mentioned before, are not necessarily implemented. In Latin America, a lot of progress has been made in the bilingual, in the concept of interculturality. A lot has been done. The models of bilingual education, for example, we say that we have moved from a transition BIE to a standard upheld BIE. However, in practice, what we see is that in most of our countries in the region, it is still a transition by BIE. In other words, the language is used in the first degrees when kids do not speak Spanish, and only as an ancillary method to move to Spanish once that is acquired. In very few schools, we have had experiences, but there are not many schools that have developed competencies in the languages, both in the original language or Spanish or Portuguese. We have done a lot of things in primary school, but in others not. No country has covered something for all of the students of all of the indigenous populations of their own countries and at all of the educational levels, as is pointed out in their own policies. They know, they acknowledge that. Now we will take a look at the tools that can assist us in improving the access and relevance of the services for the indigenous populations and the Afro descending populations. And we will see laws and policies as this happens in many countries of the region. There are laws that have been used over these past 50 years that we have, especially in the 20 or 30 years, last years, with a big progress of these policies. And we could say that these policies are in a, however, these are not properly implemented. And in many cases, this has to do with the lack of strategic national plans assisting us in implementing these policies. In most of the cases, we have policies that are like big wishes, wishful thinking, so to say, but that are not actually brought down to earth when one really comes to look at them, like strategies, indicators that will allow us to advance, and of course, with budgets that have been very clearly defined, and how we advance with the attention to more educational levels, which would be actually the outcome of a policy. Now, regarding the information system. This is something that it is true that many countries today have questions on self identification with ethnics or with their own language. And this has allowed us to have indigenous populations data in each country, but that's not enough, and it is not being properly used, the information that we use. That's why we need more information for education on the population, on educational levels per population, the location, because as has been pointed out before, there is a high percentage of indigenous population in the urban areas, but they are still described as, well, they are for rural areas. And there must be strategies of educational care. The educational populations do not have a collective right simply because they are in an urban environment. We have to construct information with the census, for example, something that will allow us to know where the schools are. Where are the schools that have things for Afro descendants throughout, and define these schools? There are countries where we already have records of BIE schools, but in other schools, this does not exist, or it is not clear, or we have not identified the schools, but there is no special acknowledgement that will allow us for all the element of the educational service be oriented to these schools. So they are mixed with the non-indigenous schools, and then it's not clear what is the service that these populations should be served with, that they should be receiving. That is why it is so needed to have a better information system that will allow us to know what the supply and demand of teachers is, how many bilingual teachers are there that have been trained with intercultural education in each country. And the same holds true for the Afro descending population. Regarding curriculum and materials, as this has been mentioned before by Silvina, there is an effort to have an intercultural approach in some countries, and to also orient an intercultural bilingual education that is aimed at the indigenous population. In some countries, BIE it targets both indigenous and Afro-descending population, and others they just aim at one of these. But what is necessary is to specify what are the different models of teaching methods that can be used. Nowadays, the indigenous populations has undergone a number of changes. Their original languages, in some cases, have been lost. But this doesn't make them any less indigenous populations. So the state has to take a look at these new scenarios and to take them into account, not only urban, rural, but also whether they do or they don't speak their mother tongue, because some of them do not anymore, but they want to revamp it, and sometimes it is still in the community, it is being spoken by the adults, and it would be quite simple in some cases to revamp it. These are the scenarios that have been started in some cases to talk about certain attention spans problems in some societies. Actually, the assessments must answer this way of taking a look of BIE, and not as a single package, but as a number of similar packages. And that's where the boys, girls, and teenagers have their mother tongue. The assessments must be carried out in their own tongue. This is being done in Peru without leaving aside common competitions in Spanish for all. There are also tests with a more cultural belonging, so to speak, in the language spoken by these students at home. This is something that can be done in other countries as well. What I said before, it is important to develop a number of models, and I think that is one of the biggest challenges we have in the region. Because what is actually happening is that the children do not speak their original language anymore. Spanish is pushing it aside, and so they are catered by a single a uniform system, and this is something that should not be happening. The language is not the only element that must be taken into account. That comes with the reality. And besides, the issue of language must be strengthened where students are losing their own original language. There are many, often the need to have an intercultural education, bilingual education, to revamp the whole system. One thing that has been seen in a number of countries, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Guatemala, where we guarantee certain elements of quality, that's when this is done, learning abilities are indeed improved for the indigenous populations with a bilingual intercultural education. An essential element is that the bilingual teachers, when they can, when the language is also spoken by that community, that they have been training in intercultural education, BIE. It is important that the model is really following the path of the culture of these peoples, that they do have materials, literature, and other elements in their mother tongue and in Spanish, and according to the model that has been mentioned before, and that we have a management with participation of the community. These four elements of school must also be completed with making sure that there's a basic structure with water and sewage, and this water is of the essence, and connectivity as a public service, internet, electricity. These cannot be seen as a luxury that is only valid for certain populations. With the pandemic, it has been clear that it is an absolutely indispensable public service or public utility. and the equipment with devices that can be used by all students. Regarding the teachers, we have already mentioned, and Carlos also mentioned it, the issue of teachers is always one of the most critical ones, especially in the education for indigenous populations. There are not enough teachers that are specialized as is required by diversity. We must make sure that the institutions train the teachers train them for diversity, and here I'm talking about the importance of this in the inclusion. We have seen that in the GEM report, but especially for the BIE, it is of the essence that there is a specialized teacher training. At some point in time, 10 or 15 years ago, it was a very strong component of progress, although in the last years it has been falling apart. And this is something that we have to revamp in order to go further in quality teaching. The last thing that I want to mention, and this is has been mentioned by Silvina, we need incentives, both monetary and non-monetary, for the teachers that are displaced to rural areas or to indigenous areas, because the situation, the condition of precarity where they work is absolutely critical. And even if they are from those populations, the indigenous teachers are always trying to move away, to go to the city, to move to ask for being reassigned to the city. Why? Because even though they are indigenous, their situation in those little villages is very precarious. So we have to guarantee an improvement in public career or incentives whereby they can get some benefits from their public careers if they remain at least 3 years in that spot, and so on. Every country has to see what the best policy for them is. And in the topic of governance and funding, no country has, although in Latin America there is a bigger investment and a search for equity, at least in theory, for all practical purposes, we see that the investment per student is the same. The issue of equity is absolutely of the essence. We do need a bigger investments for indigenous population in rural areas, and this is something that has not been achieved in the budgets of the states or the provinces. In the issue of students, families, and communities, I wanted to point out that some success stories that we find in BIE schools or indigenous population schools, they have a strong imprint of the family, when family and community has a big role to play in decision making process, when they participated not only in taking care of the school, the infrastructure, and so on, also they are part of the teaching process with their own knowledge, supporting the teachers in different fashions, carrying out community projects where one learns from outside the school with other agents. That is where we clearly see that there is a difference in the progress made by these schools. And another essential element is the alliance with civil society, where there is an accompaniment of NGOs or some indigenous organizations. There also we see that bigger effort, a better result and achievement is happening. And the last slide is a summary. We see that we have to move along strategic plans for BIE. We have to detail the goals, the results that one wants to achieve. with budgets, the training of the different players, not only teachers, mind you, but all of the chain of the BIE must be trained, must be sensitized, must be sometimes we know that the national authorities are absolutely convinced that doing what has to be done, but dripping down there is nothing, or they don't take ownership very often. The participation of the indigenous populations and the decision making process for the improvement in now in pandemic, it's even better to see we cannot reach certain areas where there's no connectivity and where the students are simply left out of the system without the participation with the indigenous population. The budget according to the actual demand. You cannot give a budget if you don't see how much is needed in order to cover the demand of each and every one of the indigenous populations of the country and all of the population of Afro descendants. The pedagogic tools, according to the models, we have to work with these tools for these different BIE schemes that we want to produce. And finally, the information system for the BIE is that the one that has to allow us to reach or outreach these communities. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena, for your presentation. We also take note of many of the issues you have mentioned. One of them relates to the instruction language, where it is taught, and language in which the thing is taught. That is done through, but not only through, the language. And another issue that I think is very important, we will move on to Q&A that we have been receiving on the chat, relates to standardization, something that you mentioned as one of the main challenges. And it relates not only with the indigenous and Afro-descending peoples, but also with the migrants. In other words, you have to think about a standard format, not only where the assessment is homogeneous, the curriculum is homogeneous and single language. Everything goes to an ideal student that has nothing to do with what you actually find on the spot. And we have other questions. We have a few minutes. We have 10 minutes. So I'd love to ask the experts if they can turn their cameras on. I would like to make two general questions and give them 3 minutes to answer these questions, both in terms of migrant populations and mobility, and in the field of intercultural education. Is Silvina there too? But I have this is because we have a number of questions. For example, for Ecuador, Jose Flores, how do you keep the oral tradition alive? It is an important issue, a topic that has been mentioned a number of times. And the other thing that was mentioned by Fanny, an author, that has to do with discrimination. So these two topics. One is discrimination. We know that one common element both for indigenous populations, migrant population, is the lack of interculturality of the educational systems, but also the prejudices and xenophobia. The school plays an essential role, but then also the community, the media, and other players. So the first thing we would ask you from indigenous populations or from Afro descendants or mobility, I'm sorry, has to do to how do we take away these prejudices. And the second part has to do with the second part, adaptability of the programs. How do we break the homogeneous school pattern and we adapt the programs and the contents and everything to the calendars, to mobility of populations, to migration, to the way they think, the peoples, how they feel, how they act of these other people. So, any topic you want to touch upon, I will give you the same order with Milena. 3 minutes, your last reflection, please. On this topic of the curriculum, we we asked the people we interviewed about civilization and curriculum adaptation given the needs, the traditions, and the culture of the migrant boys and girls. We asked them to value the learning patterns because there is a lot of lack of knowledge with the knowledge of these people and the level they have. And then on xenophobia, we see all of the successful experiences in emotional elements. And I think this is the path to follow within the school. Thank you, Melina. The good, if brief, twice good. Susana, 3 minutes. I fully agree with Milena. The topic of education for peace and solution of conflicts is essential from the school. And it is work with the boys, with the girls, with the teenagers, with the youngsters, with the teachers, and with the whole educational community. And here, what is absolutely essential is how, from the educational community, we talk about transformation, about good handling of education, and breaking the paradigms. For example, criminalization of young students. So we have to give figures because if we have figures not only about the specific facts in the educational sector between teachers or boys and girls, but for example, figures just like criminality, where they are accusing the foreigner for the criminal rates when we have numbers regarding Venezuelan migration where the average in Latin America is below 2.5%, those that are carried out by Venezuelans. So, see, considering 2.5% represents nothing, how can we break the myth, especially those who want to get into the system, that they are not fired from the system because they are not seen as a crook everywhere? So I fully agree with Milena. Education for past and solution of conflict. Thank you. Thank you very much, Susana. Silvina, you have the floor for your last thoughts. I will start with the question made by Jose, how to standard in oral traditions. I want to change a little bit the approach. I think we are highly concerned with the standardization of assessments, and we are not concerned about how to turn into pedagogical facts the collective rights of the populations. How do you turn the right to land and territory into something that goes down to earth? I think that if the states are faltering on their principles, education cannot be guaranteed if the populations lose their territories, their land. And as such, I would put the emphasis on that. I think that everything else comes later. The states are including ex post. The peoples are first displaced and then they get to the cities, and that's when they are given something, and that's only then that they are concerned about what should they give these populations. So for me, I'm sustaining this over the last publications and research because this is something that can be seen throughout Latin America. The inclusion searched by the states is an ex post inclusion. In the meantime, they have been already deprived of this system. The other question, how to dismantle discrimination. I think that we have to invite the Convention 169. Convention 169 talked about the notion of equity in conditions. If the educational system do not include the whites and the Creoles, the discrimination will continue, and it will continue. And the systems reproduce them to the extent they do not acknowledge them, and they don't take on board their own language, their historic knowledge. We have other paths that we have followed, and that's where I think the educational systems will manage to take away the notion of racism to the extent they work on the white and the half caste populations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Silvina, for this. I think that it is absolutely of the essence for everybody, from races, sexual differences, and so. And finally, Elena will give you the floor, and we have other questions just in case you want to talk, which has to do with the experience on multi-grade classrooms. But if you can't, don't worry. Thank you. In order not to repeat, because I agree with everything that has been said before, I think that something that we have to do, besides what has already been pointed out, is to use the topic of information. Discrimination also relates to the fact that we are still nations that have not finished acknowledging who we are, where we come from, what we want to be as a nation, as a country, multicultural, multilingual, and that is the basis of what we have to do. Over the past years, most of the Latin American countries, with the exception Santo Domingo, already have census that include these factors, the self-identification of the population. And there are many urban populations coming from Afro descendants or from indigenous population that have self-identified them with the indigenous population. Before, when language was the only variable used, today the self-identification increases the number of people who self-identify to descending from an original population or Afro descendants. That is something new that is also happening in the region. The topic of self-identification has grown vis-a-vis its ethnical origins, and that is what we have to take on board. We have to use that information to fight against racism, because I think these figures are talking for themselves. And we have seen more urban populations in the young, in university students, in the population in general, this notion that there is an acknowledgement of my own roots, of my origins. And that, I think, is extremely positive to work against discriminations. Now, regarding the standards that we have been using so far, I think that all of our countries have had a fever for standard assessments to know how we're working, like PISA and others, which actually are oriented to see how the system works, but they also are generating segregation against the indigenous and Afro-descending populations, and discrimination between rural and urban. They are good to see the gaps, but more often than not, they generate discrimination. And we have to be extremely careful. And when I mention about these assessments, I understand that the educational systems try to assess common competencies in the students, and the indigenous and Afro-descendant students also are entitled to develop a number of skills and knowledge, just like any other person. But how the assessment takes place cannot be one size fits all. we can have a set of common competencies, but the way in which we will acquire these competencies varies from one person to the next and from one people to the next. And the assessment, therefore, has to be different. That's how we have to reach creativity, this degree of technical intercultural capacity that will indeed allow us to cater for diversity. And here, schools play a leading role because the schools are the ones that are closest to the battleground, if I may use that expression. And they have the need for such different schools and systems. Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena. Before I give the floor to Mercedes for some announcement, I wanted to thank once again the participation of our panel members. I think that it has been a very rich panel in terms of proposals, a rich panel. His microphone is off.
Carlos, se nos cortó tu audio.
Your microphone is not working, Carlos.
Vamos a ver si ahí.
A ver ahí, Carlos.
No.
Ahora sí.
Ahora sí.
Yes.
Ahí te volvimos a escuchar.
Gracias.
Sorry about that, but we couldn't hear you. Yes, I was saying that it has been a very rich panel in ideas. So, again,
Otra vez, Carlos. Te perdimos.
we lost you again, Carlos.
Ahí estamos.
El Zoom tiene ya fallas de sobreuso.
Zoom has some problems of its own. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much, and say that we have very interesting conclusions. Amongst them,
Cuando redactábamos el capítulo,
when we were writing the final chapter on COVID for the report, after gathering information, I think that the conviction that the educational systems, even if they're old fashioned, they can change. They must change. So I think that the ideas that have been brought by Elena, Susana, Silvina, and Milena are useful to know how to change these educational systems and how they are linked to legal structures, funding systems, beliefs. And I think that as such, the contribution of this panel, of these ideas, is very useful to make progress in both mobility and indigenous populations and Afro-descendants in inclusion. So thank you all for your participation to our panel. And now give the floor to Mercedes for the announcements. Thank you. Mercedes, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you to the panel members for everything. The link of the survey is available on the chat. If you can take a few minutes to answer, it is very important for us. And so we end panel number 4. We will move to a 10-minute break, but please remain in this room so we can continue with the next activity and the last activity of the day, which is panel number 5 on education in the people deprived of freedom. Thank you very much.
and financing that supports it. But this system doesn't just appear like magic. Without planning, the whole education system is threatened, along with Malia's dreams. So what is educational planning? It starts with all of the relevant actors coming together to create a vision for education. They anticipate the future with the resources of today. Different tools are used throughout the planning process to highlight any problem areas and help with financing and resource allocation. At the end, the stakeholders have turned the vision into a plan of action for Malia and her peers. But let's start now, because Malia can't wait. The government and education officials must lead the way and believe in the plan. It must also stay responsive to the local context, such as the geography or demography of the local population. And what if a natural disaster hits or a conflict erupts? Planning for resilience allows the system to stay afloat. When an education system is carefully planned, the fate of millions of children is protected, and Malia can build the life of her dreams.
La Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible 2030
recoge los compromisos de 193 países para dibujar un mundo mejor. Son objetivos audaces y ambiciosos.
Debemos actuar ahora.
En UNESCO creemos que la educación es la clave para cambiar el mundo.
Es la mejor inversión que puede hacer un país.
Por eso la educación de calidad es un derecho.
Que debe ser garantizado para todos y todas.
Gobierno, sociedad civil, sector privado, movimientos sociales,
junto con los organismos internacionales,
deben unirse
para garantizar una educación inclusiva,
equitativa,
de calidad y con aprendizaje a lo largo de toda la vida.
Para lograr esto, la UNESCO es tu principal aliado.
Juntos podemos construir una educación para transformar vidas.
Mi nombre es María Soledad Cisternas Reyes, soy abogada y cientista política. Soy también chilena, soy persona ciega. Fui perdiendo la visión a lo largo de la vida por una degeneración de mi retina. Desde allí comencé a pensar la importancia que tenían los derechos en relación a una persona con discapacidad. Y es el puente que tenemos todos los seres humanos para el ejercicio de los derechos. Y esto cobra una importancia aún mayor en relación a las personas con discapacidad cuando son estudiantes, porque la educación es precisamente el medio por el cual obtienen conocimientos que los empoderan en su calidad de titulares de derechos, para hacerse visibles en la sociedad, para tener un rol que contribuya en esa sociedad y también para reclamar dichos derechos. Las personas con discapacidad hoy día tienen un rol preponderante a la luz de la Convención sobre los Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad, que promueve y protege también el derecho a la educación. Y por otro lado, la Agenda 2030 sobre Desarrollo Sostenible, que en el Objetivo de Desarrollo Sostenible número 4 nos habla de la educación equitativa, inclusiva y de calidad a lo largo de la vida. Entonces, hoy día, en la actualidad, como enviada especial del Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas sobre discapacidad y accesibilidad, ha sido una de mis prioridades luchar en favor de la educación inclusiva, especialmente desde la perspectiva de la toma de conciencia. Yo creo que todos y cada uno de nosotros en nuestros propios roles, ustedes, yo, todos nosotros, estamos imperados a contribuir desde nuestras tareas, desde nuestra posición en la sociedad, para el logro de esta educación inclusiva y de calidad. Como enviada especial, he elaborado conceptualmente un proyecto contra el bullying, que es la otra cara de la medalla de la inclusión. Hoy día no podemos obviar que la violencia en contra de niños, niñas y adolescentes con discapacidad en el entorno escolar es una barrera para la educación inclusiva de este grupo, de este sector de la población. Y por lo mismo, creo que UNESCO es una entidad llamada a contribuir fuertemente en una iniciativa de este tipo para que juntos, UNESCO y todos nosotros, vayamos logrando el propósito de eliminar el bullying hacia niños, niñas y adolescentes con discapacidad y en consecuencia lograr la inclusión educativa. Esto nos dará una mejor vida en este siglo XXI sin dejar a nadie atrás.
Saray is 9 years old and is excited to go to school for the first time. But when she gets to class, she has a hard time understanding the teacher. She also struggles with reading. At first, the teacher tries to help her, but when she continues to struggle, the teacher decides that Saray just isn't working hard enough. During a health screening, a doctor performs routine tests on Saray and discovers that she has severe nearsightedness and an ear infection. She gets eyeglasses and is being treated for her ear infection. How will Saray fare now? Will this help her to do well in school? Unfortunately, her teacher continues to ignore her in class. Eventually, Saray loses interest in school and drops out to help her mother in the fields. How can children like Saray be helped? IIEP UNESCO and UNICEF are working together to ensure that inclusive education becomes a reality for every child everywhere.